Imagine a silent night, a deserted road illuminated only by the cold light of the moon. A young man walks along, his footsteps echoing in the void. His face, marked by despair, is a mixture of regret and fear. His torn and dirty clothes bear witness to a life shattered by wrong choices. Where is he going? What has he left behind? This is a story of loss, despair, and redemption. But the road to redemption is neither simple nor painless. Today, we dive into one of the most enigmatic and moving parables told by Jesus, the Prodigal Son. Get ready, because the dark and surprising details of this story will grip you from start to finish. Before we start, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on content like this. Let's get to the video. It was a tense moment, but also one of deep anticipation. Jesus was surrounded by a crowd of people from all walks of life. On one side were the Pharisees and teachers of the law, men clothed in pride and self-sufficiency, who considered themselves the supreme guardians of morality and religious tradition. They wore long, imposing robes, displaying an authority that intimidated many. On the other side, there were society's rejects, public sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, and those who were considered unworthy by the religious elite. They were people marked by shame and the weight of their mistakes, but who found in Jesus a hope that had hitherto been unattainable. The Pharisees, with looks of disapproval, whispered among themselves, pointing at Jesus, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." For them, this approach was an affront to their laws and traditions. In their minds, holiness was synonymous with separation and isolation. They believed that God could only love those who strictly followed the law. For these religious leaders, Jesus was a threat to the status quo, a man who inverted social norms by reaching out to those on the margins. The atmosphere was thick. Every word, every movement seemed to carry a spiritual weight. Imagine the murmurs that spread through the crowd, the internal conflict of those who felt confronted by Jesus' presence. How could he, a teacher, ignore the limits imposed by society and mix with the untouchables? While the Pharisees adjusted their robes and looked on with disdain, the sinners had their eyes fixed on Jesus, eager for his every word. They had no place at the banquets of the powerful, but there, in front of the Master, they felt they belonged. Jesus, aware of the silent criticism and broken hearts of those around him, saw an opportunity to reveal something profound. Imagine Jesus speaking in a calm tone, but with an authority that transcended any human title. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words had the power to pierce souls. Silence fell around him, and everyone waited for what he would say. Jesus didn't begin with a direct rebuke to the Pharisees, nor with praise for sinners. Instead, he chose to tell a story. But it was no ordinary story. It was a narrative loaded with meaning, designed to deconstruct prejudices and open the spiritual eyes of those who were there. He knew that, behind the arrogance of the Pharisees, there were hardened hearts in need of redemption. He also knew that among the sinners there were souls hungry for hope and acceptance. The crowd was diverse, but the message was universal. And as Jesus began the parable of the prodigal son, it was as if time stood still. Every word spoken had a purpose, every detail revealed the depth of divine love. What was to follow was not just a lesson, it was a revelation capable of transforming lives forever. And then, with eyes that seemed to see into the deepest secrets of every heart present, Jesus began the story. Once there was a man who had 2 sons, the unusual request. Once a father had 2 sons. The younger one asked, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Think about that for a moment. This request wasn't just unusual, it was an affront of devastating proportions. In that culture, inheritance was passed on to children only after the death of the father. It was the symbol of a lifetime of hard work. of dreams built and sacrifices made. Asking for it in advance, while the father was still alive, was like declaring openly, "I wish you were no longer here. I want what's yours, but I don't want you." The emotional impact of such a declaration is hard to imagine. Imagine the father, a man who probably loved his children deeply, hearing such words. His heart must have been torn. This wasn't just a request for money. It was a breaking of ties, a disdain for traditions, a rejection of everything it meant to be a family. At that moment, the youngest son wasn't just asking for freedom. He was severing the link with his own history, with his roots. In Jewish society at the time, such behavior was considered outrageous. By making this demand, the younger son was putting his reputation and that of his family on the line. He was showing selfishness and disrespect, something that, for many, should be severely punished. The neighbors, friends, and even the servants of the house were probably shocked to hear about the request. It was expected that the father would react with fury, that he would categorically reject the request and discipline his son. But the father does something surprising. He grants the request. Why didn't he deny it? Why didn't he try to dissuade his son from going down such a risky path? Perhaps the father understood something that many of us struggle to grasp. Some lessons can only be learned through consequences. He could have kept his son at home, but he knew that forcing obedience wouldn't change a rebellious heart. True love sometimes means letting go. Perhaps while he was sorting out his share of the inheritance, the father already knew the risk. He must have seen the impatience and arrogance in his son's eyes. He knew that the fortune would be wasted, that the outside world was cruel, and that the illusory freedom his son sought would end in pain. But he also knew that forcing someone to stay doesn't generate genuine transformation. It's important to note the symbolic weight of the father's decision. By dividing the inheritance, he didn't just hand over material wealth. He handed over his trust, his hope that, even in the face of failure, his son could find his way back. It was an extraordinary act of love, although many saw it as weakness or permissiveness. This moment makes us reflect on the nature of free will. Just like the father in the parable, God gives us the freedom to choose, even though He knows that we will often make the wrong decisions. He doesn't force us to stay by His side, but allows us to follow dangerous paths, trusting that when we are ready, we will find our way back. The younger son's request, therefore, is more than a simple desire for independence. It is a window into the human condition. All of us, at some point, search for something outside the bounds of security, believing that we will be happier or more fulfilled. This search often leads us down paths we never imagined. But what makes this story so powerful is the father's response. He doesn't shout, he doesn't accuse, he doesn't try to manipulate. He simply allows. And it is in this permission that we see a lesson in unconditional love. Loving sometimes means enduring the pain of seeing someone you love go, even though you know they will face suffering. And so the son leaves, full of confidence and expectations, unaware that the path he chose would lead him not only to ruin, but also to discovering the true meaning of redemption. The fall. With his share of the inheritance in hand, the young man sets off without looking back. He heads for a distant country, a place where he believes he will find freedom, adventure, and pleasures he has never experienced. The unknown horizon seems promising, a land where he can live without restrictions, without the rules of a father he now considers outdated. At first, everything seems perfect. The wealth that was once safely stored away is now spent with ease and ostentation. Grand parties, lavish banquets, elegant clothes. The young man, with his money and charisma, attracts friends who surround him with smiles and words of admiration. He lives like a king, believing that this lifestyle will last forever. But time is relentless, and fortune is not infinite. He begins to spend recklessly, indulging in whims that become more and more expensive. Those who once fawned over him disappear as quickly as the money. Loneliness begins to creep in, but he ignores it, clinging to the idea that he will get it all back. The final blow comes cruelly and unexpectedly. A great famine ravages the land. The abundance of yesteryear gives way to despair. Food becomes scarce, and the cost of living skyrockets. For someone who already has nothing, survival becomes a struggle. The young man, now penniless, friendless, and homeless, wanders the streets in search of something, anything, to keep him alive. He is rejected by those who once welcomed him. His status, his appearance, even his dignity are gone. Nothing is left but an overwhelming emptiness. In his search for work, he takes the only job he can find, looking after pigs. For a Jew, this was one of the most degrading occupations possible. Pigs were considered unclean animals, and the mere fact of being near them was a cause for shame. Now imagine touching, feeding, and living alongside these animals. Day after day, he faces this new reality. His clothes are torn, his body weakened by hunger and hard work. Every time he looks at the pigs, he sees a reflection of himself, a filthy, rejected being, trapped in a cycle of misery. The darkest moment comes when he looks at the food the pigs eat, leftovers, scraps, things no one else would want, and feels hungry. But he's not even allowed to do that. He can't steal the pig's food because he doesn't even have the authority to do so. He is a lowly servant, invisible, ignored even by those who employ him. This is rock bottom, a place where dignity and hope seem to have disappeared completely. The young man is completely lost, physically and spiritually. He had sought freedom but found slavery. He had sought pleasure but found pain. He had sought meaning but found emptiness. And it is in this abyss that something begins to change. He begins to reflect. He remembers his home, his father, how even his father's servants lived better than he did now. They had enough to eat, clean clothes, and dignity. He, the son who once had everything, now has nothing. This moment of reflection is crucial. It's when he realizes the size of his mistake, the depth of his fall. But along with regret comes a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he can return. Not as a son, because he believes he has lost that right, but as a servant. Perhaps his father will allow him to live as one of the workers. How many of us have been in similar situations? Lost, desperate, with no light at the end of the tunnel? Moments when there seems to be no way out, when everything we knew and valued has disappeared. These are the moments when the most important decisions are made. The young man, with a heavy heart and a mind full of uncertainty, makes his decision. He will return home. There is no guarantee that he will be accepted. There is no certainty that he will find what he is looking for. But he decides to try, because even the slightest possibility of redemption is better than remaining in the darkness in which he finds himself. This is the beginning of his journey back, a journey not only physical, but also spiritual, of recognition, repentance, and eventually, redemption. The return. With his heart crushed by regret and the weight of his choices, the young man begins his journey back. Each step is fraught with doubts and fears. He is no longer the same as when he left home. His clothes are torn, his body is thin and weakened by hunger, and his spirit, once full of arrogance, is now filled with humility. He rehearses his words over and over again, trying to find a way to apologize. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your servants." For him, these words represent all that remains. He doesn't expect forgiveness or acceptance. He just wants to survive, to have the minimum necessary to live as a servant in his father's house. Shame consumes him, but the need is greater. As he walks along the dusty road that leads to his old home, his mind is flooded with memories. He remembers the comfort he once had, the love of his father, the security he took for granted. Now, those same thoughts turn into sharp knives, cutting him with the reality of his loss. But something extraordinary is about to happen. From a distance, while he is still a long way away, his father spots him. Think about it. The father wasn't just going about his routine. He was waiting. Day after day, he gazed at the horizon, waiting for his lost son to return. He didn't know when or even if the young man would return, but his heart never stopped believing. And then he sees a figure. At first, it's just a figure, an indistinct shadow against the horizon. But the father recognizes something, perhaps the way he walks, perhaps the tired bearing that was familiar to him. He knows without a shadow of a doubt that this is his son. What happens next breaks all the expectations and norms of the time. The father runs. He runs as if his life depended on it, completely ignoring social conventions. In that culture, men of his position and age didn't run. Running was seen as something undignified, reserved for children or people of lower status. But none of that matters to him. His heart is driven by pure, unconditional love. When he finally reaches him, he doesn't hesitate. He embraces the young man. It doesn't matter that he's dirty, that he smells of pigs, that he looks like someone defeated by life. The father sees none of this. He only sees the son who was lost and is now back. The young man tries to speak, tries to recite the speech he had rehearsed all along the way. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am not worthy to be called your son." But before he can finish, his father interrupts him. He doesn't want to hear words of self-deprecation or requests for servitude. For him, the simple fact that his son is there, alive, is all that matters. "Bring the best clothes and dress him," orders the father to the servants who are now approaching, surprised by the scene. "Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet." Each of these gestures is full of meaning. The best clothes symbolize the restoration of the young man's dignity, showing that he will not be treated as a servant, but as a full member of the family. The ring, in many cultures, is a symbol of authority and belonging. Putting the ring on the son's finger is like saying, "You are still part of us. Your position in the family has been restored." Sandals are a sign of freedom. In those days, servants went barefoot, while the sons of the house wore sandals. And then comes the final gesture: kill the fatted calf. Let's celebrate. The fatted calf was reserved for very special occasions, and no occasion could be more special than this. The father explains the reason for his joy. "My son was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and has been found." Imagine the scene. The young man who saw himself as unworthy of anything is now surrounded by demonstrations of love and acceptance that he never expected. The party begins. Music, dancing, and laughter echo through the house. The son who had prepared himself for rejection finds a love that transcends all human understanding. This is unconditional love, a love that asks no questions, holds no grudges, demands no explanations or reparations, a love that restores and celebrates. But the story isn't over yet. There is one more character whose reaction will be a reflection of many of us, the older brother. And he has something to say about this unexpected party. The elder brother. While the music and laughter of the party filled the house, the eldest brother returned from the fields. His hard work, as always, kept him away from the festivities. But that night, something was different. He heard unusual sounds, music, dancing, voices full of joy. Confused, he called one of the servants and asked what was going on. "Your brother has returned," replied the servant, "and your father had the fatted calf killed to celebrate because he got him back safe and sound." The older brother's face changed. What should have been joyful news for him was like a blow. He felt indignation rise in his chest, burning like fire. While everyone inside celebrated, he stayed outside, refusing to go in. Why celebrate the return of someone who had thrown away everything he had? Why throw a party for someone who had dishonored his father and his family? It was unfair. It was unacceptable. For years, he had worked faithfully, obeyed all the rules, carried the weight of responsibility, and yet he never even received a kid to celebrate with his friends. When the father realizes that his eldest son hasn't joined the party, he goes to him, not with irritation or scolding, but with patience and love. The father begs him to join the celebration, but the eldest son can't contain his frustration. "I've served you all these years, obeyed every order, never failed. And I never even got a kid to celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, who has wasted everything with a life of excess, gets a party?" Look at the tone of his words. This son of yours. He doesn't call him brother, but distances himself emotionally, as if disowning him. His anger was not only towards his younger brother, but also towards his father. He couldn't understand why his father showed so much love and mercy to someone who didn't deserve it. The father, with the same tenderness he showed his youngest son, replied, "My son, you have always been with me, and everything that is mine is yours. But we need to celebrate, because this brother of yours was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and has been found." These words are more than an explanation. They are an invitation for the older brother to see the whole picture. The father doesn't deny his faithfulness or minimize his hard work. He reminds him that his position in the house has never been in question. Everything he has already belongs to him. But there is something greater at stake. The restoration of a broken relationship, the rebirth of someone who was lost. The feast is not a reward for behavior, but a celebration of grace, of love that transcends merit and justice. The elder brother represents those of us who sometimes cling to a sense of personal justice, a desire for recognition and worthiness. He is the mirror of those who, even though they are in the Father's house, can lose sight of the Father's heart, a heart full of compassion, ready to forgive and restore. The story ends with the Father's invitation still open. We don't know if the older brother decided to join the party, or if he stayed outside, consumed by bitterness. This question is perhaps addressed to us. Are we willing to put aside our sense of personal justice to embrace God's grace, both for others and for ourselves? Or will we stand outside, refusing to celebrate the wonderful redemption that the Father offers? The choice is ours. The story of the prodigal son is not just a narrative about redemption. It is a mirror that reflects the complexities of the human heart. Who are we in this parable? The younger son who has lost his way and needs to return? The father who is called to forgive and love unconditionally? Or the older brother who needs to learn to welcome even when he feels that justice has been harmed? This parable is rich in layers, transcends the simple act of returning, and challenges us to reflect deeply on what it means to be lost and to be found. It's not hard to imagine that at different moments in life we are all characters, the one who gets lost, the one who waits anxiously, and the one who fights against pride to forgive. Think of the moment when the youngest son, in his misery, looks at the pig's food and feels hungry. This detail is more than a description of his situation. It is a powerful symbol of the emptiness we feel when we are far from what really matters. At rock bottom, when all seems lost, is where transformation can begin. Isn't it curious that hope is often born in the most desperate circumstances? That the light of redemption only shines brighter in the densest darkness? And the Father? He is the most perplexing character in the story. What kind of love is this, so vast and deep, that it disregards the conventions of shame, offense, and even human justice. A love that not only accepts but celebrates the return with a feast and joy. This is a love that defies our logic and sense of fairness. Because let's be honest, many of us, like the older brother, want to see the repentant pay for what they did. We crave balance, compensation. But the Father teaches that true forgiveness is a gift, undeserved, freely given, but profoundly transformative. And the older brother? His indignation is more than understandable. It's a deeply human reaction. He represents us when we follow all the rules, do everything right, and yet feel unrecognized. He embodies the struggle against envy, bitterness, and the desire for retributive justice. He shows us that even those who appear to be on the right path can lose their way, not outwardly, but in their hearts. The older brother reminds us that pride and lack of compassion can separate us from the Father, just as much as the younger son's sin did. This story challenges us to abandon our limited notions of merit and embrace a love that transcends logic. It's an invitation to reflect on how we treat those who stray, how we handle forgiveness, and how we recognize our own need for grace. What does it mean to be lost? Perhaps it's more than wandering from a path. Perhaps it's forgetting who we are and to whom we belong. What does it mean to be found? Perhaps it's more than returning. Perhaps it's rediscovering the essence of love, both in the one who waits for us and in the one we are called to welcome. The parable ends with the Father extending an invitation to the older son. Come and celebrate. It's a call for all of us, a reminder that grace is not only for those who return, but also for those who remain. The final question of the story isn't just about the older brother's fate. It's about ours. Are we willing to accept this grace both for ourselves and for others? Are we ready to step into the celebration, or will we remain outside, bound by our own expectations of justice? The choice is ours. Have you ever wondered why Jesus chose pigs to represent the lowest point of the prodigal son? In Jewish culture, pigs were considered unclean, an abomination, strictly forbidden by the law of Moses. They were not merely unclean animals, but symbols of moral and spiritual degradation. By tending to pigs, the young man wasn't just enduring extreme physical hunger. He was in utter emotional and spiritual despair. This humiliating scene serves as a profound metaphor for the moment when we stray from God and find ourselves in situations we never imagined for ourselves, where desolation and shame engulf our souls. The prodigal son not only lost his wealth but also his dignity, and by dwelling among pigs, he experienced the misery of a life without purpose or direction. This detail shows us that distancing ourselves from God leads to an emptiness that can only be filled by His forgiveness. And what about the Father? He doesn't just wait for his son's return, he runs to meet him. This gesture is profoundly significant. In Jewish culture at the time, the figure of the patriarch was synonymous with dignity and honor, and a man of such stature would never run. Running was reserved for the young and often seen as undignified. But this father, moved by unconditional love, breaks social norms to meet his lost son. He doesn't wait passively, but takes active steps of compassion and forgiveness, demonstrating that God's love knows no limits and is not constrained by human conventions. The act of placing a ring on the young man's finger is even more symbolic. It restores his position in the family, as if the son had never left, as if the mistakes he made had never existed. The ring signifies restored authority and honor, a clear sign that God's grace goes beyond any failure and fully reinstates us. And what about the older brother? He represents the inner struggle we all face at some point, the conflict between human justice and divine grace. We want things to be fair according to our limited perspective, but the Father's actions, His forgiveness and restoration of the lost son, go far beyond any human standard of justice. God teaches us that His grace is not something to be earned. It is an undeserved gift. The older brother, consumed by bitterness, cannot comprehend the celebration taking place. He sees himself as the righteous one, the one who remained faithful and, by worldly standards, deserved the greater reward. But the Father, in explaining that what was lost has been found, teaches us that God's grace is an opportunity for all, regardless of when or how we turn back to Him. The older brother is a painful reminder that even the most faithful can be blinded by their own pride, self-righteousness, and resentment, losing sight of the depth of God's forgiveness and grace. Like the prodigal son, he must learn to see beyond his own perspective and embrace the Father's unconditional love. This family portrait, with its internal conflicts, mistakes, and reconciliations, is an allegory of what happens in our relationship with God. The parable of the prodigal son is an invitation to reflect on our own journey of faith, on how we deal with repentance, compassion, and forgiveness, both toward ourselves and others. Practical applications. This story is not just an ancient tale, it is, in fact, a call to action for each of us, regardless of culture or time. The parable of the prodigal son, with all its emotional and spiritual depth, urges us to reflect on our role in the world around us and how we navigate our relationships with others and with God. When we look at the world, how often do we see people who are lost, navigating life with a sense of emptiness and confusion, searching for something they can't even name? These are souls who, like the prodigal son, try to fill the existential void with everything the world offers, yet find no true satisfaction. And as God's children, we are called to be instruments of transformation. The first example to follow is that of the Father. He not only welcomes the prodigal son back with open arms, but does so with an unconditional love that disregards the mistakes made. He doesn't wait for the son to make the entire journey back in suffering and penance, but instead takes the initiative, running to meet him. Likewise, we are called to act with compassion and acceptance. The world needs people who genuinely care for others, who know how to offer forgiveness without reservations, and who can see the potential for restoration in those who have failed. We are not here to judge, but to offer God's love in practical ways, whether by comforting someone in pain, helping those who are lost, or even through the simple act of listening to someone's internal struggles. On the other hand, we are also called to follow the example of the prodigal son. At some point in our lives, all of us stray from the path, drift away from God, and find ourselves immersed in mistakes and wrong choices. The story of the prodigal son teaches us that it is never too late to return. Recognizing our mistakes and deciding to go back to the Father's house is an act of humility and repentance that brings healing. This return is not just a physical gesture, but an inner transformation. By acknowledging our need for God, we are restored and receive grace, just as the son was welcomed back without question. However, we must also be cautious of the danger represented by the older brother. He is a depiction of our human tendency to cling to our own sense of righteousness and to be consumed by bitterness and resentment. The older brother feels wronged because, in his eyes, the prodigal son did not deserve to be restored. This perspective of human justice often prevents us from celebrating the grace given to us and to others. When we allow pride and resentment to take hold of us, we become blind to God's generosity and incapable of experiencing the true joy of forgiveness. Instead of rejoicing at his brother's return, the older brother distances himself from the celebration and misses the chance to partake in the joy of reconciliation. In our lives, this is reflected in how we handle others' victories. Can we celebrate another's success and recovery, or do we feel threatened and reject them out of pride? God's grace is for everyone, and it should not be measured by our sense of human justice, but by the heart of God.